remove the pressure feedback hose. I've removed the OBD2 port. First I disconnected the negative battery terminal. And I'll just give that nut a turn. On the exhaust feedback. Give that quite a few turns. Release that. Then disconnect this nut here and the one on the opposite side, 2 bolts. There'll be a gasket in there. And just replace the gasket when you put it all back together. Simple. I've given that a spray on the nut down there where my wrench is. So I'll just turn that wrench back a little. But before disconnecting the OBD2 port, I've disconnected the negative terminal on the battery. So we'll just give that a firm turn on that nut down there. And it's just slowly going around. I'll just take off the inlet for the intake manifold. Bolts. And you can see how gummed up that is with carbon and goo generally. It's pretty bad. So I'll give that a clean with some carb cleaner. Clean out the inside of that. See if I can clear that up. You can see the EGR valve there. It's pretty dirty inside. You probably can't see that, but I'm going to replace that anyway because I bought one. Just give my inlet a little squirt of carb cleaner. Just wipe that out on the inside. The gasket's not very flattened out, so I'll just keep that gasket. Just peel away that gasket, and I'll just scrape away the rest of it. I'll just scrape it off with that and I'll get back to you. Give that another squirt with some carburetor cleaner in a second, just to make sure I blow out all that dust out of the inlet. There's my new EGR valve. And it comes with a gasket. Nice and handy. Brand new gasket, brand new EGR valve. Nice clean inlet. Everything's nice and clean now. So I'll pop that gasket back in, just push it in. Put in my inlet. sure it's the right way up, or it's just won't fit. Pop bolts on. See the bolts there? I like to use a small extension. Use the extension to tighten up the bolts a little bit more because I can spin it faster with a socket extension. 8mm socket on this one. I'll grab my torque wrench and tighten that up to 89 inch-pounds, which is about 7.5 Newton meters. Using my torque wrench, short socket extension and 8mm socket, I'll just tighten that up to 89 inch-pounds, or about 7.5 Newton meters. Just buy a torque wrench. If you're going to do this work, you'll probably do it again. Got my new EGR valve. Put the bolts through first so it can hold the gasket in place. And I'll just pop that gasket on there. Okay, I have the bolts threaded through the gasket, and I'll just pop them on into position over the manifold intake. Tighten them up with my socket extension by finger. And I'll just slide that exhaust recirculation hose into place at the same time, just to make it easier to do this up. Now that those bolts are snugged up, I'll just tighten them up with my 10mm socket and a short extension. Just 110 inch-pounds on my torque wrench. Okay, and I've already put the inlet hose from the exhaust recirculation in place when I was putting that together. So I'll just make sure I put some anti-seize. I don't know if you can see that. I'll put some anti-seize. I get these packs for 50 cents from Super Cheap. So buy some, and I'll just put it around the thread of the nut there. Tighten that up with my shifter. Okay, I've got anti-seize on the nut, and I'll just try and thread that in a little bit by hand into the EGR valve. It's not that easy to thread. I have to move the hose a little. The inlet hose to the EGR from the exhaust recirculation, and just give it a wriggle, tighten that by hand. Thread did go in. I sprayed it with a little bit of CRC as well, so just lubed it up a little bit. Now I'll get my crescent wrench on it and just tighten that up. It'll take quite a few turns, so I'll get back to you. The delta feedback hose from the top of the EGR valve to the delta feedback pressure sensor is quite cracked and fatigued. In fact, when I tried to pull it off the connector, it broke, so I'm just going to replace that. In this pack, it looks like I've got enough length hose for two, so I'll just cut that to size. Reuse that hose. It looks as though, just check the diameter of the hose, because one is a 6mm hose, the replacement, and the other one is a 3.5mm hose. I'll just have a look at that. Cut it open in the center and see the diameter of the hose. Looks pretty much like this 3.5mm hose, definitely. I'll just cut a piece of that and put it on my EGR valve back to the feedback pressure sensor. Slice that off the connector so that I don't damage the connector. Just pop my connector back on. Just going to push it over the hose because it's a very snug fit. And I'll just put the connector on that goes to the top of the EGR valve itself. Push them together nice and tight. It's very hard to get on, so it doesn't need any hose clamps or anything. There's my new hose, and I have a spare and a long 6mm as well. So I don't know if you can see that clearly, but there's where my hose broke off to the delta feedback pressure sensor. So I'll just slice the remaining piece of broken hose off of the connector. Try not to cut through the connector or my finger at the same time. Break that piece away, and I'll just put my new piece of hose on. I have a spare one now because I made two from one, so I'll push that on really nice and tight right over the connector to the delta feedback pressure sensor. Now I'll just connect that to the top of the EGR valve. Brand new hose, brand new EGR valve. We'll see how she runs. Before starting it up, I'll just put the dipstick back in for the automatic transmission. Reconnect the OBD2 port. Computer would have cleared by now because I've had this off for quite a while. Very carefully slide that in position. And there's a 10mm bolt will tighten up there. And we'll just reconnect the battery.